Hello and welcome to this Wilberforce Institute webinar. My name is Judith Spicksley and I'm the lead academic on the Falling Through the Net cluster, and we'll be introducing the presentations in this webinar. The Institute is home to a number of researchers looking at issues of child exploitation in both historical and contemporary contexts. And last year, the University of Hull funded a cluster of 3 research scholarships to look at the relationship between child exploitation and migration, to investigate how children on the move fall through the net of protections provided by the family, the state, and international law. So in this webinar, the 3 PhD students in the Falling Through the Net cluster, Jasmine Holding-Brown, Saphia Fleury, and James Baker, discuss the progress of their research as they come to the end of their first year. Jasmine's project focuses on the ideas and practices of child rescue, looking at forced child migration from Britain to Canada and compulsory residential schooling for Indigenous Canadian children. Saphia looks specifically at modern-day child migration as a result of environmental change and particularly climate change. And James is examining the experience of forced child migration to Australia through heritage and memory. They'll all speak for about 15 minutes each in that order, and I'll introduce them as we go along. So first, I'd like to introduce you to Jasmine Holding-Brown. Jasmine is a social scientist with an MSc in psychology, who also worked as a mental health nurse in the Royal Edinburgh Hospital, supporting young people before joining the Institute. Jasmine, over to you.
Thank you very much, Judith. So hello, my name is Jasmine Holding-Brown, and I'm going to talk about my PhD research looking at child rescue schemes in the 20th century. My focus is on 20th century Canada, and I'm looking at cases involving children being rescued to understand how some of these children became trapped in slavery-like conditions through state-sanctioned practices and often under the pretense of humanitarian rescue. I want to examine the characteristics of vulnerability in regards to children and their association with particular forms of rescue and also exploitation. I want to explore how legitimacy was derived in relation to the actions of the individuals and organisations involved in these child rescue schemes. So today I'm going to give an overview of these 3 cases, which includes working class children who were forcibly migrated from Britain to Canada, Indigenous children who were institutionalised in residential schools, and illegitimate orphans confined to psychiatric institutions in Quebec. I'm going to discuss what the term child rescue means and how it has been used in academic research, and some themes that have emerged from my research so far. So the first case I'd like to talk about, and where this project originated, is the migration of predominantly poor British children to former colonial territories. I'm focusing on Canada, but it's important to note that although this is where the majority of children were sent, significant numbers were also sent to Australia and some children to New Zealand, Zimbabwe and Malta. Between 1869 and 1951, around 100,000 children were taken from British institutions and migrated to Canada, some as young as 5 years old. Many were told wrongly that they were orphans, and parental consent was often not acquired. The majority were sent to rural households to work as indentured farm labourers and domestic servants. From 1922, the Empire Settlement Act meant the child migration schemes, which were originally operated by philanthropists such as Maria Rye, Annie Macpherson and Thomas Bernardo, who had transferred some of their domestic child rescue activities to the Dominions, were now distinctly imperialist white settlement schemes, subsidised by government funding to promote overseas migration. However, by the 1930s, unaccompanied child migration to Canada was largely outlawed. Largely in response to the Depression, but also the concerted activism of anti-migration groups, including prominent eugenicists, women's groups and trade unionists, who are concerned with the influx, in their words, of degenerate cast-offs from the old world. There was one important exception, though, which, despite flouting new Canadian legislation, which outlawed the migration of children under the age of 14, the Prince of Wales Fairbridge Farm School opened in 1934 on Vancouver Island. Over the next 20 years, around 350 children were sent there to receive training before being sent to service. And although their stories are frequently less well known than those of child migrants sent to Australia, their testimonies show that many suffered similar experiences of poor treatment, labour exploitation, extreme isolation, and often from the lifelong stigma associated with being a home child. A government investigator sent to inquire about the conditions in Canada at the beginning of the 20th century later wrote that if not for exploitation, in no other way can one account for the eagerness of Canadian employers to get them, and the unwillingness of the working people of Canada to send their own children into service upon the same terms. The second case I'm looking at are Indigenous child removal schemes, and this came about because I was interested in the idea that part of the justification for child migrants being sent to Canada was the idea that they were set to inherit the empty spaces at the edge of empire, which of course were not entirely empty. The Indian residential school system was a network of boarding schools that were funded by the federal government and administered by Christian churches. Although in existence since the 16th century, following Confederation and the establishment of the Indian Act, attendance for First Nations children became mandatory in the 1880s. Between 80 and 100,000 children attended these often brutal and repressive regimes. Estimates suggest that there were around 3,000 to 6,000 deaths, and there is some evidence of torture being used. The schools were deliberately located substantial distances away from the children's families in order to minimize contact. And they were part of a broader assimilation policies, and the intention was to kill the Indian in the child, which alongside religious instruction, children were compelled to speak English or French and taught that their heritage was shameful. Compulsory residential education was phased out in the 1950s and 60s. However, the last school did not close until 1996. The residential schools are now recognised as a form of cultural genocide, and they've had a devastating legacy for Indigenous communities. The third case, and I've only recently started looking at this, involves a scandal which is not particularly well known outside of Quebec, and certainly the majority of academic research relating to it has been conducted in the French language. Named after Maurice Duplessis, Premier of Quebec between 1936 and 1939, and then between 1944 and 1959, whose tenure is often referred to as the Great Darkness. Unlike the rest of Canada at this time, in Quebec, all social services were administered by the Catholic Church, including orphanages, where 20,000 children were at this time housed, often on account of the stigma of being born outside of marriage. These institutions were frequently hugely overcrowded. It has since come to light that a significant number, perhaps as many as 5,000, but potentially more, of these children were falsely diagnosed as mentally ill, denied an education, and in some cases experimented on with entirely unnecessary procedures in order to secure additional funding. This was because hospitals received greater federal funding per head than orphanages did, both of which were run by the church. In one case, an entire orphanage was reclassified as a psychiatric institution. This required the collusion of church officials, medical professionals, and the state, and it had a profound impact on the development of the children, some of whom were neglected to such an extent that one report found that the majority of children spoke only in sounds until the ages of 4 to 6. Many remained institutionalized until the 1960s, when they were removed from the institutions and returned, as it were, to society. So having briefly outlined the three cases, I'm now going to talk about the prominent themes emerging from my research so far. The overarching theme that I am building my research around relates to the concept of child rescue. The term child rescue is most often used in relation to the emergence of an influential group of philanthropists and social reformers operating in late Victorian era Britain, including Thomas Bernardo, pictured here, who opened numerous children's homes for destitute children with his famous open door policy, but is also known for his more dubious methods, including philanthropic abduction, a phrase he coined himself, and forced child migration, which he considered the final stage of child rescue. The child rescuers are, however, credited with making important changes in regard to child protection, through establishing the NSPCC and successfully lobbying for changes in the law that at that time brought children's rights in line with those designed to protect animals through the 1889 Children's Charter. Central to this was the then radical view that a child could have interests that were separate to their parents, and in cases of abuse and neglect, the precedent for removal was established. Shirley Swain has summarised the child rescuer's philosophy in the phrase, for the savage child to be civilised, they need to be rescued from their parents, highlighting how the movement depended on the vilification of poor and working class parents as drunkards and child abusers. For the most part, the British child rescue movement was also an evangelical Christian movement, and this was central to their activities. Scholars such as Anne O'Connell have linked political concerns regarding the management of the empire's problematic populations following the abolition of slavery and Britain's shifting self-image and reconfiguration of its national and international obligations in regards to civilising the pauper, the formerly enslaved and Aboriginal subjects, showing that these discussions were very much interlinked. For example, the Select Committee on Aborigines, established in 1837 to survey indigenous peoples across the globe, had the express purpose of finding some outlet for the country's superabundant population. This is not to say, though, that the proponents of child rescue weren't also well-intentioned. The female pioneers of Canadian child migration envisioned it as a solution to slavery-like conditions in British institutions and an opportunity for young women in particular. However, in relation to Indigenous child removal, these motives are perhaps better depicted as an illusion of benevolence. Duncan Campbell Scott, pictured here, is considered one of the architects of the Indian residential school system, and while he wrote romanticised poetry about Indigenous people, he also stated that his primary objective was to eradicate the country's Indian population. Which brings me to my final slide and thinking about the problematic nature of the narratives underpinning child rescue. The 19th century rescue societies were excessive in their child-saving claims. The greater the wickedness, the more spectacular the rescue. The more spectacular the rescue, the greater the likelihood of attracting funds. Something which relied upon the vilification of parents and entire communities. An image of children as helpless and pathetic. And middle-class white Westerners as saviours. Ethnocentric and dehumanising constructions that in these examples saw the poor, the illegitimate, and those of non-European descent frequently as not fully human. The premise that severing family ties and institutionalisation was an ideal way to protect or help children was a reductive solution, one that was beginning to be recognised as harmful in statutory services in the early 20th century, but endured as practices in relation to certain disadvantaged groups, notably in regards to Indigenous children, and particularly within the charitable sector. What some term the fantasy of the rescue narrative is derived from the fact that it is often short-sighted. The practical act of saving does not always equate to protection in the longer term. It is, however, significant that certain groups came to be seen as worth saving, and that is important to recognise. When thinking about how the rescuers garnered support for their activities and made them seem legitimate, the alignment of these practices with certain political agendas, principally white settlement and assimilation, which alongside other financial incentives are important to consider. The assumed moral authority of wealthy philanthropists and religious authorities is clearly significant, despite these groups often being ill-equipped to provide care. Though this also implicates wider society in relation to how it deals with seemingly unwanted or disadvantaged children and how much attention paid to the arrangements set up to provide for them. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I'll hand back to Judith.
Thank you, Jasmine. Our next speaker is Saphia Fleury. Saphia has an MA in Human Rights and left her role as Senior Editor at Amnesty International to join the Falling Through the Net cluster. Saphia, would you like to go ahead? Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. In the following presentation, I aim to summarise one aspect of my proposed research, that is, my analysis of the legal landscape as it relates to people migrating due to climate and environmental change. I'm going to begin by outlining the overarching hypothesis for my PhD project. I'll then explain briefly the proposed link between climate change, migration, and child exploitation, and summarise the existing legal frameworks that may offer some protection. I'll then turn to some of the approaches to the problem provided by the literature on climate migration and proposed legal solutions. Finally, I will outline how my research aims to test some of these proposed solutions via 2 case studies of child migration. The overarching hypothesis for my research is that children fleeing environmental change face a higher risk of exploitation than migrant children whose status or situation aligns more closely with the UN's definition of a refugee, because the former are denied access to regular means of migration, asylum determination procedures, and/or refugee status. This is predicated on the assumption that climate and environmental change are push factors for migration. The question of an environment-migration connection has been kicked around in the scholarly literature for upwards of 3 decades. However, in recent years, it has become less an academic inquiry and more a stark reality. While I won't attempt to delve into the climate science to predict future migration trends, it's worth noting that a number of international agencies, among them the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the International Organization for Migration, and the UN Refugee Agency, are preparing themselves for large numbers of environmental migrants this century. When people feel compelled to move, either due to sudden catastrophes that destroy their homes and families, or creeping changes that undermine their way of life and livelihoods, they encounter risk. The risk of not finding a new home or job, the risk of being discriminated against in a new setting, the risk of losing ties with their community or members of their family, the risk of being worse off, of being trafficked or otherwise exploited, and so on. The potential for increased vulnerability and harm for people who migrate in search of a better life is huge. For those who begin from a position of vulnerability, marginalised groups, the poor, people with disabilities, children, and the elderly, migratory journeys carry the daily threat of abuse. Documented forms of exploitation encountered by child migrants on the move from environmental change include abduction, slavery, forced recruitment into armed groups, forced labour, sexual abuse, forced criminality, organ trafficking, and forced marriage. These risks appear to increase significantly for children who are unaccompanied or separated from their family, or who are subject to discrimination for reasons such as race, nationality, gender, sexual identity, ethnicity, social status, level of education, wealth, or religion. A vast body of international law exists to protect children from harm, including instruments of human rights law, humanitarian law, criminal law, refugee law, and labour law. Some are global agreements, such as the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. Others are regional treaties like the Council of Europe Convention Against Trafficking. Moreover, there are countless soft law guidelines and lists of rules and principles, as well as professional codes of conduct and national laws and policies. The range of issues and eventualities covered in these legal frameworks is also vast, and covers issues ranging from the minimum age for conscription into the military, to outlawed forms of child labour, to measures ensuring access to education and vocational training. Some are specifically designed to protect children, others have universal coverage, or focus on certain characteristics such as race. In addition to these treaties and documents, a range of other initiatives exist which, in combination, help to address the particular challenges faced by migrants, including those displaced by climate change. Some come under environmental law, like the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Others are development objectives, like the Sustainable Development Goals, or are designed to improve and harmonise the treatment of people on the move, such as the Global Compacts on Migration and Refugees. Each of these documents is a piece in the puzzle, combining to provide a safety net of rights and protections for children on the move from environmental change, at least in theory. Since so many individual pieces of legislation and guidance exist to support child migrants, why do so many children continue to face exploitation and abuse while migrating? There are several reasons. Firstly, legislation is only effective if it is implemented. And for international law, that process normally starts with codifying it in the national laws of individual countries. To do this, states must first agree to be bound by the agreement. Then there is usually a process of adopting the agreement into national law, which must be enacted and reflected in government policy. Implementing these laws and policies requires a functioning and fair judicial system and accountable law enforcement, as well as other state functions such as child protection officers, properly trained immigration staff, and an education program that informs people of their rights. States fall at the first hurdle when they fail to ratify the original agreement, as the USA has so far failed to ratify the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, the only country yet to do so. States may also opt out of particular clauses that they don't agree to. For example, until 2008, the UK reserved the right not to apply the Convention on the Rights of the Child to migrant children, only backing down in the face of considerable pressure from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and from child rights groups. Some rights, such as freedom from slavery or torture, cannot be deviated from under any circumstances. They apply even when countries have not signed the relevant treaties. Why then are there still millions of child slaves worldwide, many of whom have migrated away from their homes because of environmental change? And why do children still die in their thousands each year on migration routes or face torturous practices at the hands of kidnappers, armed groups, or smugglers? There are numerous reasons, from the capacity of developing states to police the issue or provide alternatives for children and their families, to social practices that promote child labour, to cultural concepts around the duty of the child, their role in the family, and the very definition of childhood. A major cause of child migrant exploitation, however, is immigration policy. International law often challenges governments' desire to control their own borders and citizenship practices, meaning that, as in the example of the UK not applying the Convention on the Rights of the Child to migrant children, to whom they grant certain rights. International agreements, such as the Twin Global Compacts on refugees and migrants, aim to fill this gap, but they struggle to address the complications and challenges posed by environmental migration. In that case, why not draft a new treaty to protect the rights of environmental or climate migrants? Why not call them climate refugees and give them the same rights as people fleeing persecution who are protected under the UN Refugee Convention? This would, in theory, allow safer passage to their new homes and sufficient protections on arrival to prevent them falling into the hands of their would-be exploiters and abusers. Two schools of thought have grappled with this question, sometimes described as minimalists and maximalists. Maximalists believe that climate change has a direct causative effect on decisions to migrate, whereas minimalists see migration as the result of multiple, complex drivers, of which environmental change is but one factor. Drafting a new treaty specifically on the issue of climate migration makes more sense if you follow a maximalist position, since you can more readily identify those people you would class as refugees. Just as the mass migrations following World War II led to the signing of the UN Refugee Convention in 1951, maximalists draw a straight line between climate change impacts and displacements, and call for an equivalent treaty that defines climate-displaced people and their rights. This process, the maximalists argue, would not only provide protection for potentially millions of at-risk people, but would also formally acknowledge the existence of climate displacement and allow the victims to participate in formulating a solution. In addition, some argue that giving protection to these victims would create a safer world for all, tackling the social upheavals and security concerns caused by mass migration. Finally, advocates for climate justice argue that since rich countries cause the problem anyway through their greenhouse gas emissions, they should take on the legal burden of climate refugees. Some scholars have gone so far as to calculate exactly how many climate refugees each developed nation should admit, based on their historical emissions. On the other side of the debate, minimalists contend that it is impossible to prove that a particular climate or environmental event caused a person to migrate, because there are so many other factors involved. After all, if you ask a child why they migrated, are they more likely to say, because of anthropogenic climate change, or because our cows died and my family has no money? And if you cannot prove a connection between the environment and migration, then why not create a treaty for economic refugees, or education refugees, or I just wanted a better life refugees? Since human rights law entitles everyone to an adequate standard of living, then why single out climate refugees as a special case? Others, such as Jason Pobjoy, argue that existing law is enough to protect everyone, so long as it is applied correctly. For example, the 1951 Refugee Convention should be sufficient to protect children in all modern refugee and migration situations because, so long as it is interpreted in line with current human rights law, its definition of a refugee would evolve to cover everyone in need of protection. However, legislation may not even be the best approach to this problem. Putting people into legal categories will always leave some out in the cold, and it is possible to have global migration governance that doesn't rely on treaty law. Moreover, rich states are never going to submit themselves to a treaty that prevents them being able to secure their borders against a potential mass migration from poor countries. So what's the answer? Climate change, as the maximalists argue, will indeed be a push factor for migration. In fact, multiple studies show that it already is. People have left their homes in search of a new livelihood in the face of environmental change since time immemorial. There is no reason they should stop simply because the cause of change is atmospheric rather than, say, volcanic or seismic. Yet the instances where cause and effect can be stated with absolute certainty are rare and limited mainly to sudden onset events with catastrophic impacts such as landslides or floods. Most people, by contrast, find their lives being ground down by a combination of lack of opportunity, discrimination and marginalisation, exacerbated by the fact that their ability to scrape a living from their immediate environment becomes harder every day. Would these people fit into a new treaty definition of a climate refugee? International efforts would be better placed in using existing global rules and development opportunities to lift them out of their economic misery and sidelined existence. One existing treaty alone, the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, would, if fully implemented, allow each country to progressively realise the rights of all its citizens to an extent that reduces massively the drive to seek a livelihood elsewhere. This covenant was adopted in 1966. If countries have not found the will to implement it fully by now, what's to say they will bother to implement a new treaty on climate refugees? Of course, it would be impossible to completely remove the need and impetus to migrate. In the course of this century, swathes of land will become inundated with salt water or become so dry that they can no longer support life. In these cases, planned relocation schemes that have the input and consent of the community may provide the answer to safe and regular migration, while others may benefit from bilateral labour migration schemes that allow some family members to work in other countries and support their households in situ with remittances. This can help to counter some of the fears of social unrest, even conflict, arising from a mass movement of millions of people with nowhere to go and no legal way to make a living. The next phase of my research involves considering two distinct examples of migration in the context of environmental change, and comparing the experiences of the children who migrated. The first is a study of children who left the island of Montserrat with their families following a series of volcanic eruptions in the 1990s. Several thousand people came to the UK, mostly through an assisted relocation scheme. I intend to compare their experience with that of Vietnamese children who have migrated to the UK in an irregular manner. Vietnam is suffering some of the worst effects of climate change already, including flooding, drought, and intense tropical storms, which is directly and indirectly boosting out-migration from the country. It is my hypothesis that, in the context of environmental degradation, assisted relocation schemes that are carried out in consultation with the affected individuals are more beneficial and less risky than irregular migration, and may prove a more effective way forward than the current legal migration framework, or even a new treaty aimed specifically at climate refugees. While the benefits of assisted and regular movement over irregular migration may appear to be self-evident, there are, however, early indications in my research that the issue may not be so clear-cut. With many Montserratian children who were relocated, apparently suffering forms of injustice under the UK's evacuation scheme, which could well have damaged their life chances in the UK. Meanwhile, there are indications that irregular migration may offer freedoms and opportunities that are particularly attractive to young people. My research aims to unpick these complexities through the experience of the child migrants themselves. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and my contact details are here in case you have any questions or want to get in touch to discuss my research.
Thank you very much, Saphia. So last but not least, I'd like to introduce James Baker. James is a historian who did his Masters at the University of York about the arrival into England of Spanish refugees during the Spanish Civil War. But today he's going to talk about his project which looks at forced migration to Australia. Thank you, James.
Thanks very much, Judith, and welcome to my presentation. Today I'm going to be talking to you about child immigration to Australia. And as a history of PhD candidate, my particular interest is to look into the way in which this is being remembered from a memory perspective, and how child migrants themselves are driving the process of reconciliation and repair for various historical wrongs committed. So just a brief bit of background. Between a roughly 100-year period of 1869 to 1970, there were over 100,000 British children sent all across the British Empire, not just to Australia, but also to Canada, New Zealand, and Zimbabwe at the time then, known as Rhodesia. Migration schemes were popularly and well known as associated with the British care system, with children who had been put into orphanages. As we'll see, that term is quite misleading, and the idea that urban poverty was seen as immoral at the time, so alleviating that through child migration was quite a common thing to do during this period. Migration schemes promised a better quality of life for children, but recent studies, particularly from the 1980s onwards, have shown suffering and harm inflicted upon child migrants. In the present day today, the Child Migrants Trust is helping to bring families back together who had been separated, and continue to do that to this present day, and that is one of their biggest sort of roles in this process of reconciling with historic wrongdoings. Here is just one example of a farm school in Western Australia, in Pinjarra. So Fairbridge is one of many charities that were involved in the emigration of British children. If any of you saw Michael Portillo's Great Australian Railway Journeys, he visited the farm school and saw 3 former child migrants who spoke at great length about their time and how they spent pretty much their entire upbringing at farm schools such as these, being educated and working in these environments. I think a big takeaway message from my presentation today is that, as mentioned earlier on, these migration schemes didn't come up out of isolation. So within the British care system, although a lot of former child migrants were perceived and given the name of orphans, they were more often than not, in fact orphans, at least not in the traditional sense. Many of them maybe had only had one parent pass away. They'd been separated from their parents due to their parents not being deemed suitable people to raise their children. Very shocking thing to discuss today. Urban poverty was very high during this time as well. There was very little in the way of legal protection for children during this time period, as well as a great desire to emigrate children across all parts of the empire. When children arrived, they were almost entirely alone. They had very few possessions. They were not able to spend time with their families if they had travels together. They were subjected to either agricultural or domestic labour, that was either unpaid or paid very badly, and were given no freedom to report any cases of abuse or maltreatment, and therefore abuse, exploitation, and poor education of children perpetuated itself throughout these years. And because a lot of it was suppressed and a lot of child migrants were unable to report any cases of wrongdoing, public awareness of this remained incredibly low until the middle of the 1980s, when people like Margaret Humphreys helped to interview former child migrants and really bring this important issue to the fore, having been kept sort of, at least in the British perspective, out of the public consciousness for so long. So I think there are three main questions that I'm trying to sort of deal with here within my thesis. First of which is relevance in a way to what we're looking at now in the kind of present day sort of discussions about history and how we relate to problematic histories. We're now seeing a very serious discussion about how Britain relates to its imperial past, and there's a definite discussion to be had that people such as Cecil Rhodes, who in many ways inspired a lot of these migration schemes, is now being condemned, and a lot of other figures who perpetuated a lot of pro-British Empire beliefs are now having their legacies challenged in a very meaningful way this year. We now also have to look at the ways in which child migrants themselves are shaping their own history. What are they doing in terms of speaking up about their experiences and care, about trying to help official inquiries? And they have, as we will see soon, had a very pivotal role in defining their own histories, as well as the kind of language that is used to describe the process of forced child immigration. And again, linking these two together, how does the repairing of historical wrongs kind of stem from the role of child migrants and the role of ongoing discussions about how we perceive the British Empire and Britain's imperial past in the present day? How does this influence the ongoing process of repairing historic wrongdoings? So three key themes have come out of my research so far, one of which being memory studies and the ways in which this is remembered on both public and private levels. A very broad and quite pivotal question really is kind of, what is history for? Is it simply the pursuit of truth? Is it simply looking for what happened exactly? And a lot of historians of trauma, such as Jay Winter, Marianne Hirsch, and Leo Spitzer, are moving towards a notion of truthfulness. So while we don't necessarily get a full, complete picture of what exactly happened in the past, people can still have truth value in what they say, and people can still be guided by the truth when discussing their own histories, their own traumas. So history can incorporate truth, I believe, as well as bringing in memory, and that can be a very useful source, particularly in terms of my own research regarding memory studies. Moving on to that, we can look at how identity and truth play into kind of broader research into child immigration, and how the ways in which child migrants remember their experiences reflects kind of broadly onto nations themselves. We'll see in the next thing about diaspora. This will kind of feed into how Australia in particular defines itself as a nation. What does the remembrance of British child immigration say for Australia as a country, based upon individual experiences of migrating itself? So to tie into that, I want to sort of take a look into a kind of more contemporary perspective on empire migration, to incorporate more of diaspora. So looking at people like Robin Cohen, who looks more into the sort of longer term and cultural aspect, as well as looking into ideas of victimhood and sort of victim diaspora. So looking more in terms of the longer term impact of movement, rather than simply just the movement or patterns of movements itself. And for both countries involved, Britain and Australia, it's important to look at how this impacted upon both nations, sort of politically, racially, in terms of the ways in which both countries choose to remember and depict the process of forced child emigration itself. And kind of the last thing to look kind of more specifically into the emigration itself, there are kind of two main questions, and to look at, first of all, why it was at this particular point in time, 1980s and late 1990s onwards, that research into this particular area became more prominent. Memory studies itself became a more prominent issue, and memory as a historical tool became more accepted during this decade. We also see people like, as I mentioned before, Margaret Humphreys, finding out about child migrant schemes, and the influence she's had has been huge in terms of later inquiries that have taken place, as well as societal factors that factor into this, such as new conceptions of victimhood, of the rights of children, that have in many ways helped this process along. And this kind of feeds into how the public perceives forced child migration. If we look into, say, again, victimhood and how it's entered sort of mainstream consciousness, this defines in many ways how this issue is perceived. It was once perceived as something that was positive, that had benefits to children, but now, in the light of recent discoveries about abuse and exploitation inflicted upon child migrants, is looked upon far more unfavourably in the British consciousness and the Australian consciousness as a result. In terms of kind of sources of memory itself, numerous interviews have taken place throughout this sort of time period. One of the most influential and recent cases has been interviews conducted by the National Library of Australia. This was a comprehensive 200 participants strong study, and included the testimony of Harold Haig. He sadly passed away later that same year, but he spoke after Gordon Brown's apology in 2010 on behalf of the UK government, and was one of a number of former child migrants who campaigned and championed the voices of the British home children when looking into retrospective justice and helping to, again, heal and repair historical wrongs inflicted upon them. On the next slide, I'll show you sort of an example of a memorial, a more provincial one, but there are a number of statues in Australia that commemorate child migrants. To the best of my knowledge, there are no sort of statues or anything other than sort of local plaques in the UK, but there are more statues, to the best of my knowledge at least, in Australia dedicated to child migration. And tying into the diaspora theme, a lot of these sort of mnemonic markers look into the longer term and cultural impacts of sort of the process of emigration, and looking into the later lives and the discovery of the suffering inflicted upon them and the hardships they had to endure both during and after their time in farm schools and the Australian care system more generally. So here is the stated example, and again reflects the later lives of child migrants, not just looking into the fact that child migrants arrived here, but looking at the fact that they settled here, and looking into how their later lives were affected by the process of emigrating itself. And one of the most well-known, I guess, visual pieces of media would be Oranges and Sunshine, the 2011 film directed by Jim Loach, starring Emily Watson and Hugo Weaving. And it's largely based on Margaret Humphreys' work, Empty Cradles, and depicting her work in helping to reunite families and the sort of vehement opposition that she faced when trying to champion the voices of child migrants that had been so long repressed, both in British and Australian contexts. So this is in many ways quite a vital source. A lot of people kind of discovered about this phenomenon through this film. And what is largely a biopic of Humphreys herself, this is a very useful source for understanding how the public understands forced child immigration, and gives a visual depiction of the ways in which immigration affects child migrants in later life. So a very important source indeed. So sort of three initial findings that I've found at the moment are that former child migrants are very much at the forefront of the process of reconciliation. They've taken part in numerous independent inquiries, conferences, museum exhibition unveilings to further enlighten the public about their lives and about trying to put across how these experiences can be prevented in the future. So this is very much a case of allowing former child migrants to continue to speak up about their experiences now in adulthood. On the next slide, I will show you some excerpts from apologies that have taken place by the Australian and British governments, but they speak into a very important point, that it is not just one issue, but also reflects how countries treat their children. And both of these apologies speak into the desire to prevent child trafficking, exploitation in all contexts, not just historical, but present day. So this really does inform policy concerning the rights of children, as well as broader issues such as human trafficking. So this does have a very important precedent in the broader political context. And we're seeing today that there are continuously new exhibitions, new television programs, heritage installations that are continuing to bring this issue into public consciousness. There are collaborative efforts by, say, the Merseyside Maritime Museum in Liverpool and the Immigration Museum in Melbourne, Australia. I believe it was just at the beginning of the last decade, in creating a heritage reminder of child migration based upon stories of child migrants themselves. So there's an ongoing process of trying to commemorate and visually depict and preserve the child migrants' experience. Just to leave you on these two excerpts here, the apologies conducted by then Prime Ministers of Australia and the UK, Kevin Rudd and Gordon Brown, both see this issue of forced child immigration being a shameful part of both countries' histories, and wish to see this as being a turning point to allow nothing of this kind to ever happen again. So this has a very vital part about how we understand the rights of children, and how countries in the present day need to protect and treat their children from the risk of abuse and exploitation. So these were, in the eyes of many former child migrants, huge turning points, and many of them saw this as a huge part of the reconciliation process at large. So both very recent, and show that this is very much still a live issue being driven by former child migrants themselves. Thanks very much for listening.
Thank you, James. And thank you to all three of our speakers today. That brings to an end our webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to know more about the work of the Wilberforce Institute, you can visit our website, follow us on Facebook, Twitter or Instagram, or sign up for our blog. And the details you'll find on the screen below. We also run a programme of public webinars, which you're very welcome to attend, and you will find the details of these on our blog site when they're going to happen. Thank you very much for your attention.